are certain women in popular culture that queer women seem to adopt collectively. You know the ones, the women that shouldn't be role models, the ones that are complicated and messy, intimidating, and sometimes outright terrifying. um, but somehow, despite all this, they inspire this almost cult like devotion. We've seen it with Miranda Priestley from The Devil Wears Prada, who I've made a video about before. We've seen it in Killing Eve with Villainous. We've seen it as well with Agatha Harkness, again, who I've made a video on. And perhaps there is nowhere more obvious for this kind of thing than within the Wentworth fandom and Joan Ferguson. Now, if you haven't watched Wentworth, it's a prison drama with a lot of queer women and non-women as well in it. And Joan Ferguson, aka the Freak, well, she's not exactly what most people would describe as a very lovable person, to be honest. And she isn't explicitly a queer woman per se, but she's been adopted by us. And Joan is very complicated, but she's a cold person, calculating, manipulative, obsessive, and to be honest, a little bit monstrous as well. And if you spend about 5 minutes in the Wentworth fandom spaces, you'll quickly discover that there is a surprising number of queer women that are fascinated by her, despite all of these flaws that she has. Um, and that's what I want to talk about today, because I don't think the fascination is just about Joan Ferguson. I think that she taps into something much bigger than that. It's something about power, repression, female rage, and the complicated relationship queer women often have with femininity itself. Because if we look closely at Joan, what we're really looking at is a woman who's refused to be what the world expected her to be, and that's fascinated queer audiences. So, let's talk first about the lesbian love affair with difficult women. So, before we talk about Joan specifically, I think there's a pattern that we need to talk about, because Joan Ferguson is not an isolated case. Queer women have a long history of becoming attached to difficult women, not kind women or healthy women, difficult women. Women who take up space and make other people feel uncomfortable because they won't soften themselves. If you think about the likes of Miranda Priestley, Villanelle, maybe some people that Sarah Paulson's played, the list can go on forever, right? But every time one such character like this appears on screen, it seems that queer women collectively lose their minds. Straight audiences are often asking, like, why do lesbians love her so much? Like, eh? But the actual answer is quite interesting, because for generations, women in fiction have largely been allowed to occupy just a very narrow range of roles. Those roles can be things like being supportive, nurturing, maternal, empathetic, helpful, kind, beautiful. But the moment a woman becomes powerful in ways that aren't socially acceptable, then things start to change. They can be villains and dangerous, threatening, even monsters. And that has queer audiences looking at these types of women and saying, that's interesting, let's explore that more. And that leads me on to the point about monstrous women, because one of my favourite observations about queer culture is that we often adopt the women everyone else are afraid of. Historically speaking, that isn't actually a surprise, because for centuries queer people have occupied those positions outside of societal norms. We've often been viewed as strange, different, threatening, dangerous. That isn't because we were, it's because society fears anything that doesn't fit into the established expectations, especially when it comes to religion, etc. You know, how many times have people been told you're going to go to hell for being who you are, right? Female villains, they often occupy a very similar space to that. The woman who refuses to obey social rules becomes frightening. Think about fairy tales, folklore, mythology, the witch, the crone, the sorceress, the woman that lives beyond society's expectations. And again, powerful women become monsters. Joan Ferguson belongs to that tradition. In many ways, she would align with a modern witch type figure, not literally, just symbolically, because she exists outside of conventional femininity. She exists outside of the warmth and the softness that society expects women to be like. And she's pretty terrifying, to be honest. But here's the thing, queer audiences think that terrifying women look remarkably free. And it's not healthy, no, it's not admirable, it's just freedom. Those are two different things. Now, Joan doesn't perform femininity. I think one of the reasons Joan resonates so strongly with queer women is because she rejects the performance of femininity. Before anyone panics, I am not saying that Joan isn't feminine, but she doesn't perform femininity in ways that are designed to comfort other people. She doesn't smile to ease tension. She doesn't soften herself for difficult conversations. She doesn't make herself smaller. She doesn't reassure people. She doesn't prioritize being liked either. And that's very unusual for female characters because most women spend their entire lives being taught that to manage the emotional discomfort of everyone around them, you have to be polite, smooth things over, be approachable, and don't be intimidating. But Joan doesn't do any of that, never ever. And if someone is uncomfortable around her, she literally doesn't care. And that might sound simple, but it's actually really radical because many women, they spend years carrying emotional responsibilities that were never theirs to begin with. And when you watch a woman completely reject that burden, it can feel strangely liberating, even when the woman is objectively awful. Now, why do I think this resonates with queer women? Um, I think it's because queer women as a whole have a complicated relationship with traditional femininity. Not every single queer woman, of course, but many of them. Because being queer, I should say, it often forces you to examine social expectations in the ways other people probably don't have to do. Like, what does it mean to be a woman? What does femininity mean? Who gets to define that? How much of it is a genuine experience or not? These sort of questions emerge naturally when you already exist outside of one major social expectation. And what Joan represents is a woman who has completely stopped asking for permission. She's not trying to be acceptable or fit in. She doesn't want to earn approval. She exists on her own terms. Obviously, her terms are often terrible ones. However, that can be freedom in itself, which is fascinating. Many queer women know what it's like to spend years trying to be accepted and easier to understand, to be less threatening and strange, but she never does that. I guess that could be part of her appeal. And then there is the power that she holds. Ultimately, Joan Ferguson is a power fantasy, not in the sense that other people want to be her. I think most people who watch Wentworth, even those that might fall into this bracket we're talking about, will be horrified if they met the real Joan, okay? That woman is scary, but she also represents a kind of power that women rarely get to inhabit. Male anti heroes have dominated television for decades, and they can be complicated. They're allowed to be ruthless, morally grey, obsessive, but when women do it, it's not the same because women usually are supposed to be sympathetic and, well, Joan isn't like that. She refuses all of that, rejects it even. She doesn't care about being understood or forgiven. And she creates something that's unusual, a female character with the same narrative of freedom that is typically reserved for men. She gets to be ugly, not physically maybe, but emotionally and psychologically and morally. She fails and spirals and she gets to become a monster. And that can be fascinating because it's pretty rare, and queer audiences tend to appreciate rare things. The character of Joan represents something society has always struggled with, and that is women who take up space, women that can't be controlled, women who become powerful enough that others have no choice but to react to them. And historically, those women tend to become villains, not always because they're evil, but because power that a woman holds is viewed differently depending on how she possesses it, right? Because if a man possessed power, he may be portrayed differently or seen differently than a woman who possesses power. So a man might come across as commanding, but a woman might feel more intimidating. A man might be more respected, but a woman might be seen as dangerous. Joan Ferguson takes that to the absolute extreme because she's a nightmare. She's a nightmare character, and a nightmare version of female authority, of the woman that can't be controlled or softened or managed. So while we as viewers might be scared of her, we also can't stop watching her because there is a fascination with her and maybe a question, and that would be, what would it feel like to stop apologizing for existing? And I think this is where our fascination with Joan Ferguson begins. It isn't with her crimes, her cruelty, her mental health, you could say. Um, it's about her power and her refusal to become something that other people expect her to be. She refuses to shrink herself. But in the next part, I want to talk about a thing that's truly transformed Joan Ferguson from being just a terrifying villain into more of a fascinating character in underneath the fear. Because underneath her image and her power is repression, and underneath her desire for control is loneliness. Once we start talking about some other characters, we'll be able to see walls Joan has built around herself, and we understand why queer audiences didn't just fear Joan Ferguson, they recognised something in her, something that's actually deeply human and pretty sad. That's where her story gets really fascinating. So, we've already talked about power and female villains, and we've talked about how queer audiences tend to gravitate towards women that refuse to shrink themselves. But power itself isn't what makes Joan Ferguson a fascinating character. Her power is her armour. Her real story is underneath where the armour cracks. because underneath all of that, all of the facade, the black gloves, her perfect posture, the terrifying stare, there's something Joan spends most of her life trying to hide, and that is her vulnerability. And I think that's where many queer viewers stop just admiring her as a character and start emotionally connecting with her. It's not because they like her and her actions, of course. It's more that they understand what it feels like to spend years of hiding parts of yourself from the world. Because Joan is a fortress. And one of the most striking things about her is how controlled she is. Every movement she makes is deliberate, every facial expression is measured, every word is carefully selected. Nothing about her is accidental, nothing escapes or leaks out. She is a fortress, and she's built that fortress around herself. Nobody gets in, nobody sees what's underneath, and nobody can get close enough to hurt her. On the surface, that makes Joan seem incredibly strong. But when you look closer, it actually reveals something very different. Because people who feel safe and secure don't need walls that high. They don't spend every second controlling how they're perceived. Joan isn't just powerful, she is on the defense constantly and relentlessly, maybe exhaustingly so. Everything about her existence feels like survival, and that's where things get even more interesting because queer people can understand what it's like to be in survival mode. Now, before I get any further into that, I want to be clear that I'm not saying Joan Ferguson is a metaphor for being queer. I'm not saying her experiences are the equivalent to queer experiences because they're not. What I am saying though is that many queer people can understand the emotional reality of hiding, monitoring yourself, and learning which parts of yourself are safe to reveal to the world and which parts aren't and that need protecting. Because many queer people become experts at self-surveillance. We learn to watch ourselves constantly, how to speak, dress, act. Who can we trust? What can we reveal and when? And sometimes that's subconscious. We don't even know we're doing it. And after years of being like that, walls around ourselves become automatic because you don't just hide from other people. Sometimes you hide from yourself. And that's why Joan feels strangely familiar to some viewers because of all of her power underneath it is someone trapped behind her own defenses. And that's one of the things, like the defenses she has. You see, one of her greatest strengths is control, but it's also one of her greatest weaknesses because she tries to control everything: her environment, emotions, her image, her relationships, and she needs to know what's happening all the time. She has to be the one in charge, and she needs to stay like several steps ahead of everyone else around her. That can come across as impressive until you realize how lonely that's got to be, because real intimacy requires something Joan can't tolerate, and that's uncertainty, vulnerability, and trust. The very things that create meaningful relationships are the things that Joan fears the most, and therefore she remains alone. And that isn't because she wants to be alone, but because she doesn't know how not to be alone. And honestly, that's quite heartbreaking. Underneath all of her manipulation and cruelty is a person that desperately wants connection but has no idea how to create that. And I think queer audiences are often particularly sensitive to stories about isolation because many of us knows what that feels like. We know how it feels to believe that if people really knew us, they might reject us. And we know what it feels to be different and separate and misunderstood. Not in the same way Joan does, but enough to recognise the emotional shape of it. And that's why the character of Joan is compelling. It's not just because she's powerful, but because she's profoundly lonely. Once you notice that loneliness, it's impossible to unsee, because every interaction she then has feels different. Every act of control starts looking like fear, and suddenly the monster feels human. Now, if we talk about another character, Bridget Westfall, uh, she is a person who threatens everything Joan has built. Because what makes Bridget so important, it's not romance, it's exposure. Bridget sees Joan not as the governor or authority figure or terrifying persona, she sees her as Joan, the woman. And that's dangerous because Joan, has spent her entire life making sure nobody sees her. But the moment somebody begins to understand her, she's no longer fully in control. When someone gets close, the walls become vulnerable. When someone matters, she's got something to lose, and that scares her. And I think one of the reasons queer audiences respond so strongly to their dynamic is because it's fundamentally about visibility, about what happens when someone sees parts of you you've spent years trying to hide. Whether you've experienced that through coming out, first love, self discovery, or simply allowing yourself to be vulnerable, it's a very relatable experience. Being seen can be wonderful, but it can be so scary at the same time. I also think one of the saddest things about Joan is that she doesn't really know what to do with genuine human connection. In her world, she understands that power and control, manipulation, strategy, but connection, not really. Because connection requires surrender, maybe not total surrender, but enough to let someone matter, enough that someone could potentially hurt you, enough that someone could see the messy parts of you. And that's where Joan struggles. Because for someone who has survived through control, vulnerability feels like danger. Her every instinct tells her to pull away, regain control, protect herself, even when she actually wants to be close to someone. And that's tragic because it creates an impossible cycle. The more connection she wants, the more she fears it. The more she fears it, the more she becomes isolated. And the more isolated she becomes, the more she longs for the connection, and around and around and around it goes. There's another reason why people are drawn to Joan Ferguson, and that's because lesbians or queer women love subtext. And Joan and Vera become so significant for queer audiences. Now, Vera is another character within Wentworth, and Joan and she have, let's say, a complex connection throughout all the seasons with a lot of subtext. And you see, for many years, queer women have survived on subtext, on those implications, glances, subtle chemistry, relationships that are never fully acknowledged. Entire generations of queer women have learned to read between the lines because they had no choice. And so, as I've said in my other videos, we become experts in recognizing longing and tension, and we recognize desire, and we see all these things even when stories refuse to name it. That's because of history. Queer audiences often engage with characters differently. They're not just looking at what is literally said, but what isn't. And it's not just actions, but emotional undercurrents. Joan and Vera are fascinating because they tapped into that tradition. They have a relationship that is built on intimacy, exposure, vulnerability, emotional tension, where the viewers interpret it romantically, psychologically, or somewhere in between. It's created something deeply compelling. And perhaps that's something we can talk about in another video. Overall, the real reason I think Joan resonates is not because people are drawn to her because she's evil. or that she's the monster, she's scary, or she's some perfect queer icon. I think queer women are drawn to her because underneath everything else, Joan represents a very human fear. And that's a fear if someone sees us, they won't stay. The fear that vulnerability makes us weak, intimacy is dangerous, the fear we could be too damaged to be loved. Now, I've mentioned obviously queer women, but those fears are not unique to just queer people, of course. They're human fears, and they're fears that many of us know intimately. Joan embodies them in the extreme and dramatic and very unforgettable way. By now, we know that Joan Ferguson is not just a villain. We've moved beyond her power and authority and fear, and we're left with something much sadder. Joan is a woman that desperately wants connection but doesn't know how to receive it. And a woman who has built walls so high she's become trapped behind them. So I want to talk now about why Joan Ferguson became more than just a character for many queer women, because the story isn't just her power, of course, it's her loneliness, her rage, her survival instinct, and it's about why it's difficult for women to continue to hold such a powerful place in queer culture. Joan Ferguson is probably the loneliest person in the room. You see, one of the things about her is she's almost always surrounded by other people. She's rarely physically alone, so whether she's interacting with inmates, enemies, allies, psychologists, even, people are always around her, and yet she feels isolated in almost every scene. It's one of Pamela Rabe's greatest achievements as an actor, and it somehow makes Joan feel completely alone even when she's standing in a crowded room. Because loneliness isn't always about physical isolation, sometimes loneliness is the inability to connect and to be understood or allow yourself to be known. And that's Joan's entire reality. She can control people, intimidate, manipulate, but she struggles to connect with people. That's why her story feels so sad. I also think Joan has a certain appeal about her because she is unlikable. And I think one of the reasons queer women often gravitate towards characters like Joan is because we're used to searching for ourselves in places other people don't look. Historically, queer women haven't exactly been overwhelmed with representation, and for a very long time, there weren't many open queer female characters. And even when they were often written in very narrow ways. There was the nice lesbian, the tragic lesbian, or the supportive best friend. And these characters were supposed to be acceptable and easy to understand, but Joan isn't easy. She is extremely complicated, and queer audiences often appreciate complicated women because complexity itself feels quite refreshing. She's allowed to be contradictory and difficult and fascinating without being a good person. That's something women are rarely permitted to be. Now, Joan is not a role model. I think that's a very important thing I have to say in this video, because every time people discuss characters like Joan, someone inevitably says, but she's awful. And yes, she is. She absolutely is. Joan Ferguson is not a role model. She is not somebody people should aspire to become. She hurts people and manipulates them and makes terrible life choices. Nobody is defending that or arguing otherwise. Characters don't have to be role models to be meaningful. Some of the most compelling characters in fiction are deeply flawed, and in fact, the flaws are often what make them more interesting. The goal of this isn't to excuse Joan, the goal is to understand why audiences remain fascinated by her, and them are two very different conversations. So, what Joan represents for me is that she is someone that appears again and again in queer culture, the woman who refuses to conform, the woman who exists outside of expectations and who becomes frightening because she can't be controlled. Whether we're talking about villains or witches or powerful older women or other female anti-heroes, like, the pattern is consistent. Society often fears women that step outside of prescribed roles. Queer audiences often find these women fascinating because queer people know what it feels like to exist outside of those expectations. Again, not because the experiences are identical, it's just because emotional themes overlap. The differences, the isolation, the defiance, the survival, themes like that appear constantly in queer storytelling, and Joan happens to embody all of them. So, in conclusion, why are queer women so drawn to Joan Ferguson? There isn't a single answer. It's not because she's a lesbian icon, it's not because she's a role model, certainly not. And I don't think people approve of her actions. I think really queer women are drawn to Joan because she represents things that we are rarely allowed to be: powerful, complicated, unpleasant, obsessive, angry, fascinating, all these different things. She doesn't shrink for other people, she doesn't make herself more digestible or easier. She is herself. She exists on her own terms. Yeah, those terms might lead to destruction, but they do make her unforgettable. Because Joan Ferguson taps into something that's existed in queer culture for generations: a fascination with women who refuse to behave, those that challenge expectations, that occupy space they weren't supposed to occupy, women who became monsters, and that is simply because they refused to be what anyone else wanted them to be. And perhaps that's why queer audiences continue returning to Joan. It's not because she's good, certainly not. She's not healthy or aspirational. But beneath the monster, beneath the gloves, the armor, the walls, there's something that's familiar. A woman trying to survive, a woman who longs for connection and has this terrifying loneliness about her. She can be profoundly human underneath it all. And that's why Joan Ferguson continues to haunt us. Once the fear fades away, long after her shocking actions and long after the story ends, we're left staring at a woman who had all the power in the world and still couldn't find a way to stop being alone. And that's far more tragic than any villain could ever be. And so, I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please let me know. Leave a comment, a like, subscribe, hit the bell. It really helps the channel grow. I appreciate you all. And until next time, take care.